think we need to have a discussion about Bessel van der Kolk. Some people may say, who in the world is that? I don't even know who that is, but he's written a popular book. He's been a popular researcher for quite some time. And, you know, the work has gained such popularity, I think we have to have a discussion about him and his work. His book is called Body Keeps the Score. And the phrases and concepts, honestly, are like everywhere as we think about trauma. And so I want you to give some background on his concepts, what he proposes. Many people take it on the face of it and say, oh, this is scientific, this makes sense, and accept it as fact, when in reality it's theory. We're talking about trauma theory, and there are three major theories. The first one is resilience, the science of resilience, and the second is more of a genetic understanding, that there's some sort of predisposition of our genetics that makes some people more vulnerable to trauma than others. And then there's the third, which is the most popular, and that's what van der Kolk proposes, this concept of the body keeping the score in trauma, that something happens neurologically and we store these things. So I want us to get into detail on this man and his work. And so talk a little bit about some of van der Kolk's concepts that are really critical, that we hear all over the place in this discussion about trauma and trauma theory.
Yeah, I'll start with briefly just about van der Kolk himself. He's a Boston-based psychiatrist and PTSD researcher since the 70s. And he's a professor of psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine, the director of National Complex Trauma Treatment Network, and basically his bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score, published in 2014. In many ways, it's complicated enough to sound scientific and accessible enough with anecdotal stories to qualify it as a pop psychology book just flying off the shelf. So he really, is now in this position straddling between scientific celebrity and guru. And he's known for his famous quote where he says, if the memory of trauma is encoded in the viscera, in heartbreaking and gut-wrenching emotions, in autoimmune disorders and skeletal muscular problems, and if mind-brain visceral communication is the royal road to emotion regulation, this demands a radical shift in our therapeutic assumptions. So even here within this quote, van der Kolk's emphasis is on memory, the memory of trauma encoded in the viscera, and secondly, emotion regulation. And then this mind-brain communication. And then he says now vast array of physical illnesses, psychological diagnoses, negative emotions are all at root caused by trauma. And as you put it, right, that we ought to be familiar with, his theory, because his school of thought lies at the heart of everything, of trauma-informed care today, and kind of taken at face value as evidence-based behavioral healthcare service by many, from policymakers, educators, mental health establishment, and the general public. And so, and it's, by the way, like critique of van der Kolk is not new. That has been done even within the PTSD research field with memory experts like Richard McNally, Harrison Pope, Elizabeth Loftus. Most recently, Michael Scheringa, who's a psychiatrist, in his books, Analysis of the Body Keeps the Score, and the second part, The Body Does Not Keep the Score. He has critiqued his claims, look at them and say they are unfounded. But again, the concepts that continue to be peddled in our world today, or even in the biblical counseling circle, especially with regard to the memory of trauma and emotional regulation or dysregulation.
Yeah, and that's where I want to go. I want to talk a little bit about memory. I think we can't really overstate the popularity of van der Kolk. I mean, you said it's a pop psychology. It's to the tune, Francine, of over 3 million copies of his book sold since 2014 when he published this work. So we're talking about the saturation and influence of some of his concepts, as you mentioned, not just at a very popular level, but in hospitals, in educational institutions, in school boards, in inner city policymaking. The influence of this concept really has pervaded everywhere. The concept of parenting has been influenced by the concepts of gentle parenting and things like that. So what we're describing, these ideas have been proffered everywhere from Bessel van der Kolk. And so it demands that we give some attention to it and at least assess, not dismiss it outright, but start with a place saying, okay, what are his claims? What is he stating? What scientific research is he offering? What of this is philosophical? What of it is legitimized science? And we have to deal with that. So memory is certainly influential. You mentioned a couple of people, Elizabeth Loftus, who's very important with the history of memory and understanding memory. She was very helpful in understanding historically the concept of repressed memories and helping us to move beyond that concept in and of itself. You mentioned Michael Skringa, who has written several books. You mentioned a couple of those. One of his first was The Trouble with Trauma, and where he critiques van der Kolk. He's a professor emeritus at Tulane University. So, he's a secularist, Darwinian, if I remember correctly, and so he's not a religious fanatic, but he's offering critique, saying that the things that van der Kolk is promoting are not scientifically grounded. You also have critiques from many others, and it's really helpful for us to get into that. So several particular claims that he makes, and some of the words that we would hear in terms of memories or repression, right? Or these things, when we experience trauma, being stored in the body that leads to what's called dissociation. I think it's important. So let's talk about those concepts, because that's where we hear, sort of at the popular level, this is what's happening. Trauma happens, then I feel sort of separated from what happened, or I remove it from memory in some way, or I push it down and dissociate from it. So use some of those concepts to help us to know a little bit more about van der Kolk.
Yeah, so we'll start with the concept of dissociation. You can find terms like, they would say dissociative amnesia, fragmentation, dissociate in almost any literature on trauma. So as you put it, whether or not there is an explicit reference to van der Kolk and his book, the idea of dissociation is prevalent, and it's commonly understood by trauma-informed proponents that dissociation is a disconnection between a person's thoughts, memories, feelings, and action. And when an individual has a history of trauma, the body and brain are fading out or shutting down of the nervous system in response to an overwhelming sensation of helplessness and fear. According to van der Kolk, he says that dissociation is the essence of trauma. The overwhelming experience is split off and fragmented so that the emotions, sounds, images, thoughts, and physical sensations related to trauma take on their own life. The sensory fragments of memory intrude into the present. That's your intrusive thoughts. And as long as the trauma is not resolved, the stress hormones that the body secretes to protect itself keep circulating, i.e. the cortisol. And the defensive movements and emotional responses, i.e. the amygdala, keep getting replayed. Now, a lot there in that statement, but what van der Kolk here is saying is that trauma results in dissociation. It's this splitting off, this fragmentation of memories that are now re-experienced by a person as physical symptoms, like panic attacks, physical sensations, and he even goes so far to say eventually physical illness because of this chronic stress state along with psychological disorders.
Now, I want to talk about this concept of re-experiencing, because that's really how he frames the concept of storing things in the body, storing psychological problems, storing what leads to emotional problems, or even he goes so far beyond Freud in the modern sense and saying not just emotionally and psychologically, but storing these things physically. And basically what he says is these things are unresolved trauma in the body that we experience over and over again in different ways. So talk about that connection and how van der Kolk understands the concept of re-experiencing this trauma. And then sometimes in the literature we may see it as re-traumatizing, that kind of language. So help us to understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, again, that no idea or theory or falsehood is born out of a vacuum, and it just is given a new flavor. And van der Kolk himself borrows his theory from Pierre Janet, who's a contemporary of Freud in the early 19th century. And Janet's view of trauma is, he says, psychological trauma is a life experience that causes a powerful emotional shock, separate from conscious awareness and voluntary control, leading to the fragmentation of unintegrated memories manifesting as pathological automatisms. These traumatic memories are not being recorded into memory in the normal way, and so they become, quote, pathogenic secrets or mental parasites, which then trap the person in an endless state of existential horror, which in today's language, the body keeps the score. So now the body takes the place of the unconscious. Now, what I think is so fascinating is that, you have Herman taking on borrowing Freud's concept of repression as it pertained to sexual abuse, as it pertained to sexual trauma. But Genet's view of psychological trauma is not just sexual in nature, it's actually wider to the life experience, the day-to-day life. And that's where Van der Kolk uses. So now it's not just, victims of rape or war veterans. Now it's anything. The idea that, traumatic memories are not going to be recorded, and so they become pathogenic secrets stored within and then surfaced out in physical or psychological disorders.
Yeah, what you're doing, I think that's very helpful, is going back to Genet. What you see is this confusion or conflation that's happening between mind and brain, where we want to talk about things being psychological, but theoretically we want to put it into the biological. Or something that we may say, hey, we recognize this biologically, now we're stating it as causal for the psychological. And I think this is a really important piece of the puzzle, because going back to somebody like Pierre Genet, he didn't have some of the modern neuroscientific ideas. What they were trying to do is they were seeing symptoms that were happening with people on various levels, and they were trying to give explanation as to how and why this is happening. And that's where you can pay attention to the philosophy that's infused with these concepts. Again, not dismissing a person's experience, but the way in which these experiences are interpreted by somebody like Genet. And then it caught on to where now Van der Kolk picks up on it, is it's philosophically driven. It becomes the lens by which they see and try to interpret traumatic experiences to explain, why a person feels the way they feel emotionally, why they, feel, why they have biological problems, and so on. Now that gets us to Van der Kolk's concept of stress-disease connection. What I mean by that is that some stress because of experiences, some stress because of re-traumatizing or re-experiencing unresolved trauma, that level of stress now is directly related to, in a causal effect in Van der Kolk's thinking, to disease in some way. And this presents itself in our central nervous system, in the limbic system, in the parasympathetic nervous system, and so on. So unpack that concept a little bit, because when we start getting at that level, man, that sounds really scientific and intimidating to a lot of people. But again, we're talking about theory, and help us to understand how he tries to make that connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So what we see, right, is like old themes of hysteria, neurosis, repression, dissociation, now adapted with neurobiological explanation, entering into the mainstream of psychological science and capturing the fascination, or people are enamored now with this new explanation.
Now, before you get in, I think it's important what you just said, if I can help people to understand the history here, right? So when we get to 1980, something happened in the history of psychiatry where psychiatry was sort of like a discipline without a home. They didn't know where to go, what to do. They were sort of a confused bunch, not having a real science that upheld their status as a legitimate discipline. They start to see medicine introduced with theoretical hopes in the 1950s. What that leads to is a changing of the concept of the whole structure of mental health, from really a Freudian framework to, when we get to the 1980s, now we shift to what's called a biological framing. That's why you go from what used to be called romantic psychiatry, which is much more of a psychotherapeutic approach to mental health and those concepts, into now, in a modern sense, what is called biological psychiatry. So trying to explain the things that are happening in a mental sense, or the immaterial part of man, from biological causation. Van der Kolk is riding the wave that's happening in the 1980s, moving in that direction. And so we see this connection where stress, he's automatically now, from a philosophical standpoint, connecting that to biology. So keep going in describing, just give some background into how van der Kolk is working, and fill the gaps in here for us.
Yeah, so you have your first component of, right, we talked about the traumatic memory, that part of the unconscious. Now you have the second piece of it, which is this biological explanation of stress, disease connection, or they will often use the words like dysregulated nervous system or emotional regulation. So according to van der Kolk, he says that after trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system that has altered perception of risk and safety. And he proposes that this happens through the amygdala being hijacked and a chronic stress state, where he says that the amygdala is the smoke detector, fear center of the brain, which is why trauma now makes that part of the brain hypersensitive or insensitive or not functioning. And we've talked about, even according to Ledoux, that's not true. And so what van der Kolk here is saying is that if we don't resolve the trauma, the body keeps thinking it's in danger. So then stress hormones, i.e. cortisol, keep circulating, keep going, and stressful experiences, whether divorce or final exams or loneliness, he says, have a negative effect on immune function. And so now the person is in this chronic stress state of anything that could be stressful, and then the cortisol level will keep being elevated for an extended period of time. But as we've talked about, the cortisol is not the body's main stress hormone. It's involved in a variety of phenomena like drinking, eating, thinking, that's not just pertaining to stress. It's also involved in multiple other functions for the body. And, as a steroid hormone and amygdala, its activity does not just pertain to fear response, but it also involves, a wide range of other mental phenomena like eating, thinking, drinking, using language, and so on. And so what he then uses, these mechanisms now tagging on, which we've talked about, they're really pseudoscience when you look at the research. And even when they study, cortisol PTSD people, that what they found shockingly was that it's a lot lower than what they thought. And so then van der Kolk, uses eclectically from different places. He tags on polyvagal theory from Stephen Porges to say that now this explains this permanently fight or flight free state. And then he tags on, wrongly misrepresents Ledoux with regards to amygdala. And then you just see this hodgepodge of ideas that are misrepresented, debunked, not proven by science, to now make this extraordinary claim that chronic stress can now impact the body to have diseases, to have, immune function that will be impacted. And any kind of extraordinary claim needs to be backed up with extraordinary science and evidence, and it's not.
Yeah, it's so important. And I want to make very clear that the error that we see in somebody like van der Kolk, he's promoting concepts on some level that, some scientists may have stated, hey, the cortisol levels are raised in this type of situation. But what he's doing is he's taking his theory and now borrowing bits and pieces and trying to make sense of the whole in a way that starts to now misuse what we know or don't know to be true about science. And, that's the way that error is propagated. Error is never just plainly error. It would be easy to spot. Error comes in the form of taking things that are partial truths and now putting it together philosophically. Kind of one final thought. You and I have had lots of conversations about myths. And those myths, I think we talked about 10 specific myths. Those conversations are directly related to things that underlie van der Kolk's perspective and Body Keeps the Score, because they're really established as truth claims in that whole concept of trauma theory. And so we don't have to rehash all that now. What I want you to do is just to give a basic summary of, if we were to try and help raise someone's level of discernment when they hear these concepts, because a lot of people are writing not giving credit to van der Kolk. They might not use his name. They might not even use the Body Keeps the Score as a book to reference, but they're using the concepts. So what are some of those primary concepts that when you hear them, they're not always what they may seem. Although he describes them in a very philosophically acceptable way, he might describe them with stories, as you mentioned, in very anecdotal ways. He may use partial bits of, scientific language, and they can become convincing. Describe and maybe help our folks understand a little bit more about things that we should be warned about, or we should pay attention to, that when we hear these things, it should just raise a level of concern to think about.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting that you can kind of trace back, right, with Herman's psychological trauma, the language of that with Freud, with Van der Kolk, a neurobiological conception of trauma that really started with Genet view of it's still psychological, now tacking on scientific jargon, these big terms. I think another component too, or concept that's used is even the component of memory, where the idea is that, Van der Kolk is saying that the body remembers if the mind cannot, which is, and that goes back to the recovered memory movement in the 80s and 90s. And if I could just even read a series of questions just to show the similarities between that, where back then, therapists would use that, to now try to uncover 60 symptoms of repressed memory. And this would be a list of questions of diagnosis, where she would ask, do you feel numb or have trouble getting in touch with your feelings? Do you have joint pain? Do you startle easily? Do you have flashbacks? Do you have trouble distinguishing memory and reality? If you have some of these warning signals, you probably do have repressed memories, unquote. Now, you can substitute these questions with an attempt to diagnose if you have an unresolved hidden trauma according to the Body Keeps the Score framework. And so, really not new. In fact, Richard McNally, he's a Harvard psychology professor and memory expert, where he says that the recovered memory movement in the 80s and the 90s was the worst catastrophe to befall the mental health field since the lobotomy era. And so we kind of see that, as that gets phased out and that got shut down with all the lawsuits, now it's kind of just repackaged, tagged on, adapted with scientific sounding language. But really the explanations, the theories have been around for many years.
Yeah, and the danger of them is they become a means of explanation. And here's where you can see the philosophy at play. As you mentioned, might I have joint pain? That happens when we get older. If I don't eat healthy, don't exercise, or even just age. Might I have some of the other symptoms that he describes? Yeah, those things are real experiences that we have as our bodies are decaying, without question. Now he's going to try and explain it. Oh, you have these things, it's explained by this philosophy. So you see how he's appealing to things that are actual, that are true. Yes, my joints ache. Yes, I'm struggling with this aspect of my body. Now he's going to give a philosophy that tries to explain it. And that's the problem, where we see a divorce from what's actually true versus what's actually proposed in theoretical form. And that's what we have to be careful of. We have to watch out for, if we will. So,
and I think, if I may, that even the solution that he proposes becomes appealing, that it's not just psychotropic medication, that people have been, that they know that it does not work. And so now what he proposes is what they would say, right, holistic. This new modality, from wide-ranging, from yoga to neurofeedback, to meditation, to breathing, to this now whole range to take care of the mind, body, psychosocial, all of that. And so I think that is also part of what is so appealing. That's not just medication.
Yeah, and I think what it should do for us as believers is push us back to the scripture to understand, does God's world present a reality where our bodies decay? Yes, we don't have to deny some of those facts. Does God's world, the reality that he presents in the scripture, does it give us scenarios where a person is experiencing at deep level some sort of suffering or evil done against them? Yes, it does. So how do we understand what a person is experiencing, the symptoms that they may be exhibiting? It can tell us a lot about the person. It can tell us a lot about reality in their situation. And you know what? Our job as biblical counselors is to give someone the perspective of reality from God's perspective. It's to help them to see what they're experiencing, not from their own perspective, not from van der Kolk's perspective, not from the perspective of Judith Herman or any philosopher like that, or the history of Pierre Genet. It's to understand from God's perspective what a person's walking through, why they may be walking through it, what God says about their situation, and how they get out of that situation. And that's really key. And what I see happening is we're being distracted by these empty philosophies. We're being distracted and veiled against what the Scripture actually says. And that's my biggest concern is we're seeing, we can confess certain things about Scripture to still be true, but what we don't understand is the anthropology, the view of man that van der Kolk presents is not a view of man presented in the Bible. And so we're trying to fix a man that's not represented in the Scriptures. And that's where we see this crossover, where we, little by little, in an unintended way, we start to separate ourselves from what the Scripture says about who man is, why we experience the things that we experience, even evil done against us, and how we're supposed to respond from God's perspective. And that's my biggest concern. Thank you so much for helping us to understand so much more about van der Kolk. What are some of the philosophies and ideas that we may hear broadly? It's very helpful. And, Francine, we've talked about so much. We've gone through van der Kolk and his body keeps the score. We've talked about Judith Herman and some of her concepts of complex PTSD. We've talked about a lot of the myths that really are the foundation of van der Kolk's perspective. And you've helped us to lift up some rocks, I would say, and look under those rocks, to pay attention, like, should we give credit? Because lots of people are wanting to say, you know what, we want to bring to bear in our counseling, even in a biblical counseling scenario, we want to bring to bear all that psychological science has to offer. And I think what you've helped us to do in some of your work is to, okay, let's ask the question, is this psychological science? Is it something that's actually scientific? You've uncovered, as I said, those rocks. The work that you've done, I think, has been tremendous. You've done all of us a great service, I think, by asking the appropriate questions, going and tracing the history of development of these things, and seeing what you found, I think, is that much of this is so much more rooted in philosophy than it is in scientific reliability or validity. And we're seeing it continue to develop because it is rooted more in philosophy and theory. And I just want to tell you, I'm so grateful for your work, the hard work that you've put in over the last several years to find out about trauma, that which is impacting us in the church and people broadly, and it's certainly impacting the biblical counseling world. So thanks for giving some deep thought and background as to where some of these things come from and why we feel so much pressure to be impacted by them. So thank you so much for your work and your time.